Welcome to this exclusive interview with Mr. William Morris, the global tax leader at PwC US. Mr. Morris is a recognized expert in tax policy and its impact on global business. Today we have the privilege of discussing crucial topics at the intersection of tax policy, sustainability, and innovation. We will explore tax and policy incentives to the green transition and digitalization, mechanisms governments are using to stimulate investments in the green and circular economy, and the global experience in green taxonomy. Mr. Morris, can you share some insights into the tax and policy incentives that countries around the world are employing to encourage the adoption of green technologies, such as green energy, machinery, equipment, and electrical vehicles? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this is actually a really interesting area. For many years now, people have talked about the need for green tax incentives, for other ways of incentivizing the development that we need to move towards a sustainable energy transition. But these have always been relatively small scale up until now. There have been incentives for individuals to buy solar panels, for example. There have been some incentives for business to use various energy-saving mechanisms. But it's really only in the past year that very widespread use of the tax system has come into play as a huge mover of potentially doing this. And it's always good to remember that there are two sides to using tax in the area of, again, energy transition. There are those things which essentially try to disincentivize certain types of activity, whether that's polluting, whether it's overuse of energy, indeed whether it's trying to equalize the treatment of certain types of energy. But there now also are these very substantial incentives which are beginning to come into play to actually encourage people to do certain things as well. Probably the biggest example of this by quite a long way at the moment is the US Inflation Reduction Act, so-called, which contains $370 billion worth of green tax incentives. And these are employed over a wide range of areas, as you indicated in your question. It's to encourage the use of electric vehicles. It's to encourage the production of materials which would be used in those vehicles, like batteries, but also other types of energy as well. It's to encourage research into energy-saving measures. Again, a huge incentive there. And obviously there was an interesting overlap there with Pillar 2 and what I was talking about in the main panel about Pillar 2 penalizing certain types of credits and incentives. And it took a lot of work at the OECD to make sure that the Inflation Reduction Act credits were okay. And a number of other things which look at aspects of green taxation, green transition, including just transition, which essentially is ensuring that people believe that this is fair to them, because this question of legitimacy is also very important when it comes to green taxation, to that transition being accepted. So there are a lot of principles out there already. Obviously, we see the EU now reacting to this, probably less on the tax side, but perhaps loosening up other rules, including around state aid. So this has become a very active area, and one of the questions for smaller countries is how they react to this as well.
That sounds very interesting. Probably many others are still to come in the near future. Will, what are some best practices that businesses and governments should take into consideration when aligning their tax strategy with sustainability goals, especially in the areas of green energy and digital innovation?
Well, again, it's a really good question. It's one, obviously, that again is being very much focused on at the moment. In terms of innovation, as I said, there are certain incentives. I mean, there are sort of long-standing ones, old-fashioned almost, if you call for research and development, but ones which are much more focused in bringing certain types of products to the market. Because again, government governments generally accept that they're not in a position to actually do this innovation themselves, and therefore they need to encourage the private sector to do that. And there is a lot of work also to encourage academics to cooperate. And again, one of the things, not just in the US that you see, but also that you see in the EU, with partnerships between academics, between private sector, between government, to incentivize that through the very large funding programs is important there as well. As I said, another element of this is actually, do people feel that they're being reasonably treated? Because obviously as you move towards an energy transition, there are certain sectors which are going to be less favorably treated. Coal mining is an obvious example. And how do you deal with that? And therefore, some of the incentives which have been offered in the Inflation Reduction Act are very much focused on areas which could be deprived. So there's an element there of that. Being clear about what it is that has an impact on getting to net zero is important as well, and that's where the taxonomies come in. Obviously, the most developed of those is the EU taxonomy, and as I again said before, how that interacts with the CSRD, the Corporate Reporting Sustainability Directive, and some of the other measures around sustainable reporting becomes very important, because again, there needs to be an element of public trust in this, and part of that is that public reporting which will take place as a result of this. So you can think of lots of incentives, whether these are very narrowly focused, for example, on batteries. We may be almost too focused on batteries in some senses. How do you think about other types of energy transition as well? But again, these incentives are intended to bring much faster to market the changes that we need.
Indeed, regarding the digital innovation, we may see that it was accelerated. Beside the economical gains, it was accelerated also because of social impact and health issues which arose because of COVID and its direct impact on the possibility of people to get out. So in a natural way, it was somehow developed by itself, without the involvement of some governments. Regarding the green taxonomy has gained preeminence in recent years. Could you provide some examples of how countries have implemented green taxonomy frameworks to classify and incentivize environmentally friendly investments? Especially on this topic, we may say that we at the AmCham platform held already an ESG conference. We get aware more and more on this topic, and also the companies which are involved in this.
Well, again, as you know, this is, in a sense, reporting about sustainable investments and, to a certain extent, the reporting about the use of incentives themselves is a somewhat controversial area, again, particularly in the US. And I think one of the things that you try to do with a taxonomy, and the EU has tried to do with its taxonomy, is to identify those areas which are truly important and to make sure that the reporting on that is consistent and that people understand what they're doing. This issue of greenwashing is important. I think we have to, it's important that there is accuracy here, but there is also a focus on what's important and what's not important. And the way the taxonomy does that, and the interaction now that you have between various groupings, not just obviously the EU, but the International Sustainability Standards Board, for example, and others, GRI, who look at various types of sustainable reporting, is quite important. So, again, primarily the interaction of the EU taxonomy with the CSRD, but also, I think the other one is CSDDD, and various of these other standards which are coming online will ensure that there is a consistent picture here. But again, focusing on what's important, what actually is crucial in sustainable supply chains, for example, and then, essentially incentivizing that move towards those sustainable value chains, supply chains is important as well. And obviously, as I say, there is always going to be controversy about this. There are going to be certain industries which feel that they're badly treated. There are going to be those who wish to move things forward, who feel that other industries have been, sort of actually too fairly treated. But striking a balance here is really important.
While it is so different from one country to another, from one part of the world to another, what emerging trends do you foresee in global tax policies regarding the green transition, digitalization, and their landscape in pursuit of sustainability goals from the business's point of view?
Again, it's a really interesting question because, as you say, for the moment, this is being done in different ways by different countries. One would hope that there would be more consistency as time moves on. I mean, obviously, many of the goals are actually linked to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. And there are other emerging standards. The OECD has just begun to look at this topic, although perhaps their ambition has been pulled back from trying to truly come up with a framework to, at least for the moment, looking at issues around carbon mitigation. But these are important issues, and I think as people's confidence grows, then hopefully there will be more of a chance to come up with a more coherent set of standards across the world. But again, it is a really difficult issue because countries are in different places. Countries which are resource rich, particularly natural resource rich, are going to look at this in a different way to countries that aren't. Large developed countries which already have a very well developed infrastructure system are going to look at this differently to countries which don't and need to build, including the use of concrete, for example. So again, figuring out how you work this out, it's not just a question of standards. Again, I keep coming back to this issue of actually how do you pull people into this system, and part of it has to be to compensate those who are going to lose out most for this. I've talked about individuals before, I've talked about industries. That's also true about countries as well. And therefore thinking about this, and you see this when we come to, for example, a number of the COP meetings which have now taken place, is there is this split between countries which are still in the development phase and those which are more developed. But again, there are global differences as well. It's not just about rich versus poor, it's not just about resource poor versus resource rich, but it's also about those, honestly, who are closer to the equator and who suffer, potentially stand to suffer much more damage much more quickly from climate change than those that don't. So it's a complex system, and reaching a way, finding a way to balance that out is going to be important, and that will require a level of consensus, which so far it has not been easy to achieve.
And how much does it overlap, if it does, with traditional tax incentives, and if there is an understanding that it should be changed something?
Again, it's not a completely straightforward answer, because one of the things which is, as you look across the tax systems are still largely nationally based. And therefore they're focused on, as they should be, on the citizens in that country. They're focused on economic growth in that country, on encouraging economic growth in. So part of that is the use of certain incentives to do that. But part of it, as I say, may also be, if you want more people to come in, you don't just need a more developed education system, you need better roads as well. You need better transportation facilities, all of those types of things. And those can obviously cut across what it is that you're trying to do with green incentives. I mean, again, if you look at, for example, the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism in the EU, that does very heavily impact the production of certain types of materials from certain types of the world and their sale into the EU. Again, if you are then, when you become a member of the EU and are subject to that as well, then that means that the import of certain types of goods is going to become much more expensive, which again, you might think of in terms of infrastructure. So finding a balance for all of this is something which needs to be worked on. It's not just enough to say, here are the incentives we need to encourage X, Y, and Z to happen, all of them good things, but actually here's how we make the system work together more harmoniously, and we don't have countries which are, in the end, essentially not in agreement, and therefore perhaps frustrating those broader efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Morris, for sharing your valuable insights into the complex world of tax policy, sustainability, and innovation. Your expertise indeed had shed a light on the opportunities and challenges that businesses as well as governments face as they work toward a greener and more digital-driven future. We greatly appreciate your time and look forward to staying informed about the evolving landscape of global tax policy in the context of sustainability and innovation. Thank you for accepting this interview.